Every forest has rules. Stay on the marked trail. Don't hike after dark. And if someone tells you a section of the forest is closed, you don't go looking for a reason. Most hikers follow those rules because they assume they're about falling rocks, wild animals, or dangerous terrain. But sometimes, a warning doesn't tell you what you're being protected from. In October of 2021, 3 experienced hikers entered a remote section of forest in the Blue Ridge Mountains. They had been hiking together for years. They carried GPS devices, emergency supplies, and enough equipment to spend several nights in the wilderness if necessary. None of them considered themselves reckless. That changed at mile 17. The trailhead had a temporary metal barrier across the path. Attached to it was a faded warning. Trail closed beyond mile 17. There was no explanation. No mention of a landslide, no wildfire warning, no dangerous animals, just a closure. The hikers were discussing whether to turn around when a ranger approached them. He looked at the barrier, then at the 3 men. "You're not going past that." One of them, Daniel Mercer, asked why. The ranger didn't answer immediately. He looked farther down the trail. Then he said, "There's been a problem up there." Daniel smiled. "What kind of problem?" The ranger shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Just stay on this side." Daniel later admitted that the warning made him more curious than afraid. They waited until the ranger left. Then they continued hiking. For the first several hours, nothing happened. The trail was quiet. The weather was clear. They saw deer tracks, birds, and the occasional broken branch. Everything looked completely ordinary. Until they reached mile 17. Daniel stepped over the barrier. His friends hesitated, then followed. They walked for another 20 minutes. That's when they noticed the footprints. Bare footprints. They were pressed clearly into a patch of damp soil beside the trail. The prints were smaller than any of theirs. They followed them for several yards. Then the footprints simply stopped. There was a tree directly in front of them. No footprints continued beyond it. No footprints turned left. None went right. Daniel photographed the ground. One of his friends suggested they go back. Daniel agreed. Then they heard something. 3 knocks. Slow. Deep. Coming from somewhere inside the trees. Nobody moved. A few seconds passed. Then came 3 more. This time, closer. The men turned toward the sound. Nothing. Just trees. Daniel finally said they should leave. They turned around and started walking back. After about 20 minutes, Daniel recognized the trail marker ahead. It was the same mile 17 barrier. They had somehow returned to it. The 3 men checked their GPS devices. All 3 showed that they had traveled almost a mile. But the trail had somehow brought them back to the exact point where they had started. They tried again. This time, they marked their position before moving. They followed the GPS. They walked for nearly half an hour. And once again, the mile 17 barrier appeared ahead of them. By then, the sun was going down. They decided to stop trying and make camp. They would leave at first light. That night, they kept the tents close together. Nobody talked much. Around 2 a.m., Daniel heard footsteps outside. Slow footsteps. Someone was walking around the campsite. He whispered to the others. They listened. The footsteps continued. One complete circle around the tents. Then another. Nobody dared to look outside. Then the footsteps stopped directly beside Daniel's tent. For several seconds, there was complete silence. Then, someone whispered his name. He froze. The voice sounded familiar. It sounded exactly like Mark, one of the men sleeping inside the tent beside him. Daniel didn't answer. A few seconds later, the voice came again. Daniel, open the tent. This time, Daniel knew something was wrong. He froze. The voice sounded familiar. It sounded exactly like Mark, one of the men sleeping inside the tent beside him. Daniel didn't answer. A few seconds later, the voice came again. Daniel, open the tent. This time, Daniel knew something was wrong. Mark was lying only a few feet away from him. Daniel could hear him breathing. He stayed silent. The voice outside stopped. The footsteps slowly moved away. No one slept after that. At sunrise, they discovered that Owen's tent was open. Owen was gone. His boots were still beside his sleeping bag. His backpack was inside the tent. His phone was still there. There was no reason for an experienced hiker to walk into the forest barefoot and leave every piece of equipment behind. Daniel and Mark searched the area. They found a line of bare footprints leading away from the campsite. The prints continued for about 50 yards, then stopped beside another tree, just like the day before. They called for help. Search teams arrived later that morning. For 4 days, rescuers searched the surrounding forest. Dogs followed the trail. Helicopters searched the ridges. Teams walked through areas that had already been searched twice. They found no Owen, no body, no blood, no clear signs of an animal attack, nothing that explained where he had gone. On the 5th day, searchers found something about a mile beyond the campsite. A torn piece of Owen's jacket was caught on a low branch. It was heavily damaged. There were dark stains on the fabric, but investigators couldn't determine exactly what had caused them. No other trace of Owen was ever recovered. Based on the evidence and the length of the search, authorities eventually considered Owen unlikely to have survived. But without a body, there was no way to determine exactly what had happened to him. Then, investigators examined the hiker's GPS devices. The results were strange. Daniel and Mark's devices showed movement around the campsite during the night. But Owen's device showed no significant movement away from the campsite. There was no recorded journey toward the trail, no route leading deeper into the forest. Nothing that explained where he had gone. The last recorded location placed Owen only a few feet from his tent. Months later, Daniel returned to the photograph he had taken beside the first tree. He had almost deleted it. But when he enlarged the image, he noticed something between the trees behind them. A human-shaped figure. It was standing far enough away that the face couldn't be seen. There is one rule experienced hikers learn very quickly. If you hear someone calling to you from somewhere you can't see, don't follow the voice. In the fall of 2022, 2 experienced hikers, Ethan Walker and Marcus Hale, were exploring a remote section of mountain forest. They carried GPS devices, emergency supplies, and enough food for several days above them. About 4 hours into the hike, they heard someone shouting from somewhere below the trail. "Ethan!" Both men stopped. Marcus was standing right beside him. Then the voice came again. "Ethan, help me!" It sounded frightened. Ethan believed someone was injured. Marcus told him they should stay on the trail. But Ethan stepped into the woods. Marcus followed. A few minutes later, they found an old backpack lying beside a tree. Marcus recognized it. It belonged to a local hiker who had disappeared in the same forest months earlier. Inside were an old map, a water bottle, and an identification card. Then they heard the voice again. This time, it came from directly behind them. Ethan. They turned. Nobody was there. Then footsteps started moving through the trees. Fast. Marcus ran uphill. Ethan followed. But when Marcus reached the main trail, Ethan was gone. Ethan! No answer. Then, from deep inside the forest, Marcus heard his voice. Marcus! Marcus froze. Ethan? The voice answered. Come back. Marcus called emergency services instead. Search teams entered the forest that night. They found Ethan's flashlight about 50 yards from the trail. Nearby was his jacket. There was blood on the sleeve. But Ethan was nowhere to be found. 6 days later, searchers discovered his GPS device beneath a fallen tree. The data showed Ethan leaving the main trail and moving downhill. Then his location suddenly stopped. 3 weeks later, his remains were found several hundred yards away. His death was ruled accidental. There were injuries consistent with a fall, but investigators could never determine exactly what happened. Then they found something else. Marcus had accidentally left his phone recording during the search. Most of the recording contained wind, footsteps, and Marcus calling Ethan's name. But near the end, a faint voice could be heard. Investigators initially believed it was Marcus's voice echoing through the forest. Then they checked the recording time. The voice had been captured 11 minutes after Marcus had already reached the main trail. He was alone, and he never went back into the woods. Marcus never returned to that forest. Later, he said the thing that frightened him most wasn't finding Ethan's body. It was hearing Ethan's voice after he already knew Ethan was dead. Because if it wasn't Ethan, then someone or something had been calling his name from inside the trees, and it knew exactly what Ethan sounded like.